Today, I'm chatting with Tom Van Der Lubbe, the co-founder of Visii. Visii specialise in mortgage advice in the Netherlands. Founded in 2010, Visii's purpose is to change the world of finance to make the industry better, more sustainable, and more long-term focused. As a motto of Visii's is employee first, customer second, and shareholder last, they truly believe and operate in a people first culture. In 2016, Visii adopted holocracy as their operating model and have since gone on to make it their own by adding iterations that felt more like their way of working. They are a brilliant example of how models can help you get started on a new way of working, but ultimately, it's about making it your own. In this episode, I chat with Tom about what made them decide to explore an alternative way of working. And Tom shares with me how it's not only been a philosophical journey, but also one paved with tangible results. So let's dive in. Hi, Tom, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you very much. Looking forward to our conversation.
So, Tom, give our audience a bit of context around Visii and what you guys do there.
It's very simple. We are an advisor and we do mortgage advice, and we are a broker. So that means that we compare the different options the client has, and we are paid by the client and not by the lender, which is extremely important. So from a regulational uh, from a point of regulation, it's not permitted to be paid by the lender. So it's fee-based advice, so to say.
Yeah. And you're based in the Netherlands, is that correct, Tom?
Yeah. We only do our advice in the Netherlands. Sometimes we get this kind of questions where people want to work for us in other countries, but no, we only do in the Netherlands, and there's also a reason for it. So mortgage advice in every country is different. It
Yeah.
has to do with taxes, etc., etc. But also those markets are very huge. So we have less than 1% market share, which still is a billion, but it's not a billion revenues, but a billion mortgage volume, which is around, let's say, between 3 and 4,000 mortgages.
Oh my goodness. Now, the thing is with Visii, you're not like any normal financial services, are you? Because you guys operate ever so slightly differently. So, from obviously this season is all around Maverick founders and really talking about how we operate differently. Do you want to describe a little bit how you operate at Visii? Because I have a funny feeling that's why so many people probably want to come and work with you.
Yeah, probably. Let's say, I don't know. It depends on let's say the starting point. But let's say on the one hand, I think financial sector is a difficult sector,
Mm,
to put it mildly. Um, and in the end, to answer your question, it has to do with different aspects of the way we organize our stuff. So on the one hand, we are self-organizing, which doesn't mean anarchy. It's exactly the opposite. Then we have fixed salaries without bonuses, which is perhaps for certain parts of the financial sector also a little bit strange. And then we have, and we can dive into that later, we certainly will. We are working with this kind of, let's say, different organizational style since, I don't know, 7 years or something like that. So we have to evolve our model, and let's say in this international world, we're not known for our mortgages, but we're interviewed like you also. Perhaps you also should explain how you met us. We are interviewed for this kind of, let's say, organizational lessons. We are also willing to share because we have a culture of radical transparency, so we don't have a lot of secrets.
yeah, absolutely. Now, I discovered you guys because I had chatted to Mark Peter, your colleague,
Yeah.
about your culture tours at Visii. And it's something that always fascinates me when companies open their doors to kind of go, hey, come and see how we operate, you know? And you're one of a handful of companies that do this around the world. I'm hoping there's more that are going to follow suit. But I think it's a brilliant way to have that radical transparency when you're considering a new or alternative way of working, to actually go and visit companies like yourselves, to be able to see how it's done and what it looks like. And, you know, like you've mentioned,
Yeah.
self-organizing doesn't mean anarchy. But that's what people have these visions of, like nobody's doing any work and it's just chaos. But how did you, Tom, discover this way of working? You know, how did this come about at Visii?
Yeah, you have a short answer and a long answer. Um, the short answer is that if you work yourself in a company, you see a lot of things where you start to doubt if there isn't a better way or more efficient way or more fulfilling way to organize stuff. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that's perhaps also part of my biography. I didn't study. I mean, I also study a little bit of economics, but I'm not a let's say somebody who's only interested in economics. By education, I'm even a historian, and I studied international relations and law and this kind of stuff. And I was always amazed by a kind of urgency, um, let's say, business has in general about organizing things. Because let's say from a historical point of view, organizing people is much older than our companies. So, I mean, if you have a more, let's say, Anglo-Saxon audience, you would say Taylorism and factories, and the mid of the 19th century, people start to organize production, etc. Before it was more or less merchants and handcrafts, etc. So this whole idea of organizing companies is, from a historical point of view, pretty modern phenomena.
Yeah.
Um, and especially if you zoom out and just ask the question yourself, how did they organize people or decision processes in the Roman Empire or in China or I don't know, in Greece, etc., then one could come to the conclusion that there are, let's say, we always had the same questions. How do we organize, let's say, decision processes, or how do we organize meetings, or how do we get involvement, etc.
Mm.
Um, and then it's obvious from an organizational point of view that if those questions have been around since ever, that people also have thoughts about these kind of questions, also about leadership, etc. Uh, and then if you dive in, into those topics, that you also find answers from other parts of history.
Mm.
So just take one example, just to zoom in. Um, I even got from people who studied this organizational stuff, an Ivy League professor said, you rotate the leadership role in the company. It's very innovative and also very exotic. And then I said, okay, it's not so innovative. It's also not so exotic. Um, in Athens, Polis Athens in the city state, that's where rotation also was already there, primus inter pares, and you still have even this kind of word, so the first among equals. So we see, let's say, from this current, let's say, situation we live in, where you have a kind of CEO who is much more intelligent than all the other people and thinks it's wise to take those decisions by mostly a man, take by himself. That's the normal model. Um, but it's just not the case. And you see this in a lot of discussions. You also see this about environment, where we think that circular thinking is very innovative. And you can just say, for the most periods of mankind, people thought circular since I would say the French Revolution or something like that, we think in a linear way.
Mm.
But if you talk to people who, let's say, are familiar with anthropology or other stuff, other disciplines, people will just confirm that most people always thought in a circular way.
Gosh, Tom, I wish you'd given me history lessons at school because that would be far more interesting than what we discovered. But it's fascinating, isn't it? Because, like we say, that kind of modernist Taylorism view, we're so indoctrinated into it now that it has become normalized when, like you say, there's so many pockets in history where we have organized in a very sort of tribal circular fashion. Like the fact that a lot of the time in sort of tribes that people would, have quite a lot of democracy
Yeah,
happening within tribes. And we don't tend to get that now in our sort of organizational structure. It's always very much that one person often dominates the decision
yeah.
making or the airtime. But like you say, there's all these pockets in history that we can go back to. And is that what kind of stimulated your curiosity, Tom, this kind of real passion for your history?
Yeah, let's say if you look through glasses of a historian or somebody who studied international relations or this kind of topics, uh, then you're just very amazed by, let's say, the way decisions are taken, and also by the, let's say, I would say even ignorance.
Mm,
So let's say if you know that there are different alternatives, and you have made an evaluation and then have taken a decision to do it in this way or the other way, then that would be even better. But the thing is that people don't even realize this. So, and the funny thing is that in this whole self-organizational context, to take another example, for instance, in holacracy or if you have self-organizational structures, you call a team a circle.
mm,
And people
yeah,
say, oh, that's very exotic. And then I said, okay, no matter where in the world, in what time, if people discuss something, people sit on the ground, sit in a circle, because the distance to everybody is exactly the same. So there are very practical reasons for that. Or you have a talking stick. In anthropology, people know this, and you give it to the next person, and the person who has the stick is allowed to talk, and all the other people listen to it. We call it a talking stick now, but we could
yeah,
also put it polite, that the one who talks, that the other people listen to this person. In meetings, I would say in a lot of companies, this simple talking stick mechanism even doesn't work.
yeah,
Or we take a very long table and we put the person who seems to be in charge on the one end, and all the other people are sitting, let's say, along this long table, which from a communicational point of view is much less efficient than a circle. And then you
mm,
go on a kind of seminar, and then they take the table away and they said, could you please put all your chairs in a circle? Because it makes much more sense when we spend time together in a seminar. So that's just very one simple practical example, but you have endless amounts of these kind of examples.
yeah. Oh my goodness, absolutely. And I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's so often seen as this sort of self-organizing as something. I mean, I love the fact, first of all, that it keeps getting called exotic to you.
Yeah.
Because I don't think I've ever heard that about self-organization before. So that's interesting that people call it exotic or novelty. But like you say, if you look at so many different patterns in history or anthropology, and it all kind of really blends into how we organize, how we communicate together, how we manage to achieve something. But in terms of, I suppose, that moment for you where you thought, this is how I want things to be in my company, what was kind of like your catalyst? What was your kind of light bulb moment, Tom?
I mean, I'm a reader, so I like to read books. It doesn't matter what subject. I also would say it's better to read not about economics, but to read about exotic topics, because it's much more inspiring, and you're able to combine the dots beyond. let's say, your specialism.
Mm.
But I would say those steps, or I don't know if there are light moments in that way, but you start to search and then you find stuff. And then the first thing is I'm one of four owners of the company. And then you share this book and say, okay, perhaps this is something which could be interesting for us. And then we invited somebody, and then at a certain point we said, okay, shall we try it? And then we asked our people, and we were still a very small company, so I think we were, I don't know, 10 or 12 people, etc. And then we just asked, shall we just try this kind of new way of working together? And then that's probably the decisive moment.
Mm.
Um, and then you start to evolve, let's say, this whole organizational model. So um, you try to um, become more mature and let's say from a kind of bottleneck approach, you just try to solve your own topics and
Mm.
try to avoid being dogmatic.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I think it's interesting you mentioned there about kind of, just try and read as much as possible and share it with people as well. I mean, for you, was there anything that connected to your personal kind of desires or purpose with the work as well? Because I think whenever I've read something around this new way of working, it's always connected to me on a much more of a deep philosophical level, like, being able to create more participation and inclusion for people. Just this general sense that surely this is a better way to organize, a more inclusive, a more purposeful, meaningful way to organize. I suppose, is there anything that really spoke to you when you were doing that sort of moment of discovery that connected more deeply with you?
Yes, but these are different layers, and then depending on who you want to, let's say, talk with. Let's say if I am, I can have a very spiritual or philosophical way of thinking, and I can share that with you. But if somebody is very practical, I try to give practical examples because then I wouldn't reach
Yeah.
this person. But let's say from a more philosophical way of thinking, um, I think that let's say life is very short, and this whole idea of let's say being intrinsic motivated to bring your whole self to the company. That's another attitude than human resources and doing a kind of mix and maximizing profits, etc. So that's more a kind of human aspect, um, which, for instance, in our company is called, and we didn't invent this golden rule, huh? How do I treat other people? And if I wanted to be treated in a certain way, do I also, let's say, behave in that sense towards my colleagues or external partners or whatsoever? That's the philosophical way.
Mm.
And the practical way would, for instance, be, and I just take another example. If you work with suppliers, do you pay them there immediately? So we pay them immediately. So if we get a bill, it's paid exactly the same day when the bill arrives. So it's not like, let's say, maximizing your own liquidity on behalf, let's say, and which has a negative effect for your partners. It's very practical. And then also your whole liquidity management becomes much easier because there's no difference between what's on the bank account and what has to be paid in the next weeks because everything is paid automatically. And then it's very practical. So depending on, but if somebody's very philosophical, then I would say, okay, this golden rule is something which exists in every religion, doesn't matter where in the world.
Mm.
And then I would take an example of if you have a cake and you would film no matter where in the world, and you would say, okay, let just share this cake, and I would take 3/4 of the cake, and I would take it myself and give 1/4 to the other person, and you would just film this face of the other person. Then it would be a kind of embarrassment, and that's the same everywhere in the world. This is very also practical, simple example for what the golden rule means or what it means to treat other people like you wanted to be treated yourself. And then you can make it very complex, or you
Mm.
can keep it very simple.
Yeah. I find that's always the kind of mix of people's mindsets towards self-organization is that it's both efficient and practical. When we talk about in terms of better organization, the output is often more tangible. But then, like you say, if people are more connected to doing more purposeful, meaningful work that's connected to that kind of intrinsic motivation, it has such a powerful connection to that. And I think it's good because we're all at different places when it comes to our journeys and where we're taking our company. Some of us just have pain points or tensions that need to
Yeah.
be eased. And I often say, well, that's where some of the self-organizing practices come in beautifully. But then also, if people are kind of lacking that, I suppose, that purpose, that kind of, North Star that they seem to be lacking, then I think sometimes this more deep, reflective work of self-organizing really connects to that as well. But when you were kind of introducing this to your team, Tom, what were their kind of initial reactions when you sort of said, "Oh, we might try this"? What did people say?
They actually like the idea, but I think that most people, if you would tell them that you want to have the autonomy where the stuff is done, or let's say the ability to decide yourself how how the work is done, then everybody will like this, because the opposite people don't like. That somebody who doesn't do the work him or herself, mostly himself, tells other people how the work has to be done. And then, for instance, in our field, it means that the advisor decides for the client, with the client together, what is the best solution. And that's the autonomy, but the autonomy goes beyond that. So at a certain point, we decided that the hiring process is done by the people in the team themselves. So I don't do any HR thing. So I mean, I did in the past. Uh, in a way, sometimes it's even counterproductive,
Mm,
uh, because you do hiring for jobs you don't do yourself.
mm,
That doesn't make that much sense.
mm,
And in the end, it's also the more autonomy, let's say, your people in a company have, the less work you have to do. Which doesn't mean that you don't do anything, but you can focus much more on other stuff, building the company, thinking about organizational stuff, thinking about decision processes, thinking about culture, etc. So, from if somebody would be thinking about efficiency, decentralized systems are much more efficient than centralized systems. And what I find as a historian extremely interesting is that the more capitalist people are, the more they are in favor of the capitalist system. And the argumentation is that why does capitalism work so well? Because you have decentralized decision making by consumers and producers.
mm,
And then if you talk about decision making in the company, it's more like communism, that a kind of central bureau decides on even any minor detail in the company, what's right or wrong for the person who does the work, which I find a kind of, yeah,
yeah.
schizophrenic. I don't know how I would call this, but you see this again and again. So um, there are also a lot of examples, or it doesn't matter what it is. It's if it's autonomy or rotation or and even, for instance, if you talk about decentralized decision making, I live in Switzerland, which is probably one of the most decentralized countries. You can say it's very small, but you have, for instance, in the government, there's a rotation principle. So every year, somebody else is in, yeah, is the primus inter pares. Nobody knows this. That's the Swiss system. I would say they're doing pretty well. So the more you have a kind of system where somebody is very powerful
Mm,
and thinks also mostly a he, a man, has the idea that his dentist is so huge that he should take all the decisions, uh, um, uh, the more harmful this is for those countries.
Mm.
So it's in the end it's endless, those those examples, and also those companies which have decentralized decision making are much faster. So it's always about being fast and speed and innovational speed, etc. If people are able to decide themselves how to do the work, the
Mm.
speed of to adapt to new circumstances is also higher.
Yeah. Oh my goodness, absolutely. Especially in this day and age when, your agility is essential to your
Yeah.
survival as a business.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of, you mentioned, obviously you've got this way of working, and a lot of people would, one of their biggest, I suppose, challenges when we talk about this way of working is, you often hear people say, oh, well, it won't work for our type of business that we're in, because we're in finance, for example, or, they often have that kind of, I like to say, excuse
Mhm.
about why it won't work. So what would you say to companies who are kind of saying that, of like, well, this wouldn't work for us? Like, what do you have people say that to you, and what's your kind of response?
Yeah, I have a double response. On the one hand, it's right, because let's say the bigger the company is and the more the culture is, let's say, the opposite, the
Mm,
more difficult it will be.
yeah.
And if you would do an experiment or you would transfer to another type of culture, it would perhaps not work. And then people would say, "That's what I said. It will not work." And that brings me to the next topic. I think it always depends on uh, the people. So let's say if you have a kind of collective decision-making process
Mm,
where people are interested in doing so, then it probably will work. Um, but I think you have to split that up. So let's say the bigger the company and the more difficult it will be from a cultural point of view, the more you probably have to search for a certain part of the company,
mm,
which is young, motivated, small, etc., etc. Because I mean, if you don't believe in something, it will not work. I mean, that's something
yeah,
which is for sure.
yeah. Oh my goodness, absolutely. Yeah, you have to have the belief in that what you're going to do is going to, in some way improve something, even if you just try it and experiment with it. And I always say, it's one of those things where actually you can learn so much just from trying something new, even if it doesn't, completely go to as planned. You're learning something about your organization, you're learning something about your team. So even doing a mild experiment, should we say, it can often provide lots of insight.
I mean, it's a question we often get. So what I would do is to zoom out and say, okay, let's say I want to become a more human organization or something like that.
Mm,
Uh, then I would also recommend, for instance, to start with a kind of yearly audit from Great Place to Work or another kind of organization, and just try to create a kind of environment where people really have the impression that they are heard
mm,
and that they are able to give feedback. And then even if it hasn't been the case in the past, then it will also take time. And then
mm,
and then you have a kind of feedback loop, or you can install kind of feedback loop and just say, okay, let's just start with the first topic our people mention,
mm.
just
Yeah,
to build trust.
yeah,
And then you probably don't start with the organizational model and decentralized decision making and rotation of leadership, etc., because that's just a few bridges too far.
yeah,
No, you just start with something very simple,
yeah,
and that just depends on, let's say, what the feedback in that specific situation will be.
yeah, yeah, definitely. That is some great advice, Tom, and I definitely second that. In terms of some of the kind of challenges that you've had, because you mentioned that, that you can do too much and try and redo everything all at once and essentially try and jump across a bridge that you haven't got all the steps to. What was kind of one of the big challenges for you guys? Was there a practice, an area that you thought, oh, this is actually a little bit tricky for us and we might have to step back for a little bit and kind of revisit this? Was there ever anything that really stood out for you that was a bit of a challenge or a tension area?
Mm, I mean, there always are, um, but there again is more a philosophical thing. That's also in personal lives. I mean, if people think that crises are without, let's say that life cycles are without crisis, that's not the case. And then the question is, if we succeed in coping those crises, do we become stronger? And let's say if you're interested in philosophy, it's Nietzsche. Everything which doesn't kill you makes you stronger, and that's something as a person, which you also see if you talk about character building. Let's say people who fled countries, or
Yeah.
if it are the Vietnamese with their boats, or Syrians, or people who went through a difficult phase of their lives, etc. Those people can become stronger.
Mm,
It doesn't have to be, and for organizations, it's more or less the same. So if you would see a crisis as a kind of opportunity to become stronger together, that's a
mm,
totally different mindset than, oh, there's a crisis, self-organization doesn't work. And the funny thing is, we also went through a crisis, uh, and this rotational principle, uh, let's say, then leads to a situation where people say, okay, who in our, let's say, circle of leadership or most experienced people is most suited to solve this, as an example. And
mm,
and then you do a kind of rotation. In other situations, you could also say, okay, that doesn't work. Um, uh, this strong person, the Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos of this world, they solve anything. I mean, they can even walk over the water, to take a Bible a connotation. Um, so I think every company or every person has a kind of
mm.
will have to deal with crisis, but it depends on the
Yeah,
attitude, and it
yeah.
also depends on the perspective. So if you are very focused on the short term,
Mm,
and you don't give yourself enough time to recover from something,
yeah.
then you create a different pressure. So if we are in for the long term and we own the company, then sometimes you say, okay, um, doesn't matter if it takes half a year longer. But if you, for instance, stock listed
Mm,
and you have a contract for 3 years and you have to deliver next quarter higher earnings to your shareholders, it's a different environment.
mm,
So I think it's more about zooming out and becoming aware of your situation in
yeah.
advance, because probably in situations where we would have had external investors who would be in charge of the company, we wouldn't have been able to solve certain topics.
Mm. Oh my gosh, Tom, there was so much wisdom in that. I don't know where to unpack first because I think I really resonate with what you mentioned about, this idea that there are always crises, and there's always going to be challenges that arise. And it's how you adapt to that and how you organize with that rather than, yeah, this kind of like really rigid linear path that we get so obsessed with in our business blueprint, not being able to see the opportunities and the possibilities that are around us because we're so wed to one thing, and we kind of die by the sword in that regard, don't we? When we're so, obsessed with the plan that we had at the start of the year, or the person who's leading us, it's kind of we get so stuck to things without thinking, okay, but how do we adapt and how do we organize around it? So
But
yeah, I
it's,
love what you mentioned there.
I think that also, let's say, people in the end, I mean, we all have our private lives.
Mm,
And if you ask people who are 90 what has been important, then you get totally different answer
mm,
than from people who are 30 and they're thinking that, let's say, maximizing their careers
mm,
is the most important thing in life.
yeah.
Which doesn't mean that, let's say, if you, let's say, enter the soccer field or something like that, that you don't want to win the match. That's
Mm,
something different. But let's say still be aware that you
yeah.
are playing, for instance, a game, and that, let's say, what you do in a company is not more important than somebody's personal life, as an example,
Mm,
uh, gives you another understanding. So, for instance, in our company, when somebody has a topic to solve at home, then we call this family first.
mm,
And then we just say, okay, go home, solve the topic, and come back when you're back.
yeah.
And if you, but this only works from a cultural point of view when people have a kind of team spirit,
Mm,
stay long enough in the company,
yeah.
that there is this understanding that if I'm possible to solve the topics at home, that when I'm back and next year somebody else goes home to solve stuff, that
Yeah.
I have a kind of obligation to do the extra work or to discuss how do we solve this in the team, etc. So this, and this also the golden rule. And so I think that a lot of topics are also solved by by the question, are we short-term oriented or are we long-term oriented? If we are long-term oriented, if you have, for instance, a family-owned business, then you have another way of decision making. So I I also don't blame CEOs who take certain decisions when they have to deliver certain amount of dividends, etc. I mean,
Yeah.
like, I'm only happy I'm not in that situation, but the system creates its own ways of working.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of people are maybe not attuned to that, eventually the system that you create is dictating how you have to operate. There's a lot of, you mentioned, at the start of this, a lot of people aren't aware that there is this variation in how we can work. There is a choice between being top down or being more decentralized. And so it's really easy to just default to the top down way of working.
So to come back to your philosophical question at the beginning of the podcast, and that's something, for instance, I mean, it's always difficult to give advice, but I think in general, um, especially let's say if you are young, if you're studied, etc., at a certain point, I mean, you have two options. You can just start without thinking a lot and then perhaps correcting afterwards, or you can just ask in advance. I mean, I was lucky. When I was 20, I got cancer, and I had 20% possibility of surviving. So I was lucky to be in a very philosophical, let's say, situation, to put it like that. And I think you can ask yourself, okay, what do I want from life?
Mm,
And but you also see a lot of people, let's say, who decide, let's say, to fight for climate change or other injustices, etc., or other stuff. But that's something, it's kind of reflection, and the earlier you reflect on this, the
mm,
easier probably it is. And
yeah.
if you, for instance, start a company and you say, okay, there are two possibilities. I want to sell as fast as possible because I want to become rich. That's
Mm,
another starting point. Then I want to do what I like to do with people I like, and let's do it until we're 65 or whatsoever. So I think the starting point, which everybody defines, you can define for yourself, depends on what kind of road you're going to choose. So,
yeah.
for instance, I was educated to become a diplomat, and I found out that those stuff I would have had to do
Mm,
would have become difficult, let's say, from a philosophical or moralistic point of view. So I said it's better I don't become a diplomat. Other people did, and they are ambassadors, etc. But I am not jealous to be not an ambassador somewhere in a very exotic or not exotic country. But that's something, or let's say, we are not rich. I would have earned much more money if I would have stayed at McKinsey or have done corporate jobs. But I like the job I do with other people, and I don't know. We'll see in the end of my professional life if this also from a financial point was a good or bad decision. But it also means that the question is, how do you define yourself? If I would find it very important,
Yeah.
let's say a kind of material wealth, then I better would have become an investment banker or a management consultant or partner of a big law firm or something like that.
Yeah.
Um, and but everybody has to answer those kind of questions. But I would say it would be very wise, and I would be very in favor if philosophy would be a main subject in school, because in
Mm,
the end it's about fulfillment.
yeah.
It's not about being the richest guy on the planet. It's about fulfillment and connecting with others.
Yeah.
So that's why it's often better to ask the grandparents than your parents, because your parents want to be successful, because it's this idea of security and
Yeah.
can they buy a house and raise the children and send them to university and this kind of stuff. But in the end, and that's also philosophy.
Mm,
So I would always recommend people to read philosophy, Marcus
yeah.
Aurelius, and this kind of stuff.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. I mean, it kind of comes down to as well, isn't it? Trying to define what success is to you personally and not the societal expectation of success. Because, like you say, it's really easy to think that, and especially in this day and age when you've got kind of social media and everything kind of telling you what success should be in quotes, it's really easy to get wrapped up in that and the messaging that's given to us. But like you say, ultimately, it's about your fulfillment. What is success to you personally? When I always kind of say, when I get to my rocking chair days, what will I be really excited to share? What stories will I want to share with people? That's kind of what keeps me going, experiences and opportunities. What will be the things that the crazy stories I'll be telling as an old lady on my rocking chair?
Yeah, but it says everybody can because if you have those external speakers, etc., it's something different. But if you would just ask your own grandparents, or let's say I would always ask people who are not have a stake in this or a kind of, so parents are just not a very good advisor in most of the times. And then to reflect on this kind of topics. But it is people feel it also very confronting. Eh? So even if you would ask
Yeah.
your parents or grandparents, are you happy?
Mm,
Or, and it sounds just a very normal question. Uh, are you happy with your life? Or are you happy with the life you lived? What
yeah.
were the good decisions you took? What were the
Mm,
decisions you would have taken in a different way? I mean, these kind of discussions we don't have a lot.
yeah.
We scratch the surface and talk about a lot of non-relevant stuff, but
Mm,
there it starts to become interesting.
yeah.
And then in the end you have this. Oh, you can also take a book. There's a kind of, I don't know. Then her name is somebody who treated people who were dying.
Oh, yes.
A nurse from Australia, I guess. Um, Perhaps you can put it in the show notes. And then you always see exactly the same. That all those people, it's always about connecting with others. It's always doing something for somebody else, not taking as much. So it's about altruism and not egoism. So
Yeah.
altruism gives you much more fulfillment than egoism.
Mm,
But that's not what we see in the world. So we see a lot of people who are extremely egoistic. We put them on a pedestal, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, etc., etc.
yeah.
And then wealth is the equivalent of being happy. I mean, the Americans
Yeah.
always say happy. I don't like the word happy. I like the word fulfillment.
Yeah.
Or what's the raison d'être, to
Mm,
put it in French, or in German even better, Daseinsberechtigung. What's the reason for being?
yeah.
And that's, I think, something, if you can define this for yourself
Yeah.
as early as possible and stick to that,
Mm,
uh, then life doesn't have so much noise.
yeah. Yeah, definitely. And we could all do with a lot less noise.
Yeah, yeah.
We could.
Which also means, for instance, that a lot of stuff you're not interested. I mean, there's always this quote: "You buy stuff to impress people you don't like," which I find so. And it's also, I mean, if you for yourself it's clear about it, then you can just
Mm,
walk by all those showrooms, etc., and just reflect on that. And do I really need this stuff?
mm.
Do I need this car or that airplane or whatsoever? I really don't need it. So,
Yeah.
uh,
Um,
but but if you are jealous and you think you still need it, then it becomes very difficult. So
mm,
perhaps it's better to go a little bit more slowly
yeah.
and do more self-reflection and read more philosophy
Yeah.
than let's say. I think in the end we just want to skip this question, and then I mean then at a certain point those questions come back.
Yeah, they
It
do.
can be a midlife
Yeah.
crisis. It can be, and then perhaps midlife crisis is better than if you are dying. But
Yeah.
this kind of to look into the mirror and
Mm,
ask yourself if you like what you do, or
yeah.
if you share your time with the people you like.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, that's but okay, but that's philosophy.
Yeah. Well, do you know what? I feel like that has landed us in a really nice place to kind of wrap up your words of wisdom to those listening. So, for those founders or business owners who are kind of coming across self-organization and this way of working, what would be your kind of what words of wisdom to them? You know, there's that deep reflection, but is there anything else that you would say to them, Tom, on embarking on this journey?
Yeah, I would ask. Most people don't start companies themselves, so I would, instead of discussing business cases, I would ask people why. I mean, the Simon Sinek thing. I mean, he didn't invent fulfillment or the why of things. Why do you want to start this company?
Mm,
And what's your goal or what's your exit goal?
mm.
Uh, I did once such a discussion, and I decided not to join the team.
Wow.
It was very efficient. I mean, then
Yeah.
years later, other people who started this company said to me, "Yeah, you exactly asked the right question at the right time," because the person who became very angry about this question was the person who ruined the company afterwards. So, but that's something in relationships or friendships, etc. What's the go further than the
Yeah.
normal superficial stuff?
Yeah.
And if there's a kind of friction, uh, perhaps it's a sign that you're not on the same page.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Tom, for your telling your story today and, helping us go to those deep places and ask some of those more reflective questions, because I think it's often something we skip over, right? We're too busy in the doing, in the kind of in the weeds, rather than, like you say, taking that bigger picture. So thank you so much for sharing your philosophy and your wisdom with us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Lizzie.
You've been listening to Make It Thrive, the Company Culture Podcast.